Eruption 23, the U.S. in 2016. As we near the end of the first part of our story, we should examine the remnant U.S. just prior to the outbreak of the border war. In doing so, we will hopefully understand how North America went from 20 years of relative peace to falling down a reactionary spiral. I do want to start by going more into detail about two major events in recent American history that I have glossed over until now: the terrorist attack of 2001 and the stock market panic of 2006. As we've discussed in Part 11, the attack was directly motivated by the Jewish Americans fleeing the Yellowstone eruption and settling in Israeli settlements in Gaza, and by extension, U.S. support of Israel, as stated by those responsible themselves. The U.S. coming to Kuwait's aid in 1991 could also be seen as part of the motivation in the broader regional context. However, it should be noted that Iraq has never been implicated in assisting the attackers. Rather, the attack was carried out by Iranian-backed jihadists operating out of Afghanistan. 4 truck bombs were simultaneously detonated in Palestine and the U.S., 2 in Israeli settlements, 1 outside the Pentagon, and 1 outside CIA headquarters in Langley. The Pentagon bomb did minimal damage, however the Langley and settlement bombs were devastating. Immediately after the attack, questions arose as to whether or not the West Coast was somehow involved in the attack. Given the distant relationship between the West Coast and Iran and its proxies, this seemed unlikely, and both parties denied these allegations. In the 15 or so years since the attack, no evidence linking the two has ever been uncovered either. The attack prompted the U.S. to launch bombing raids and a limited ground campaign in Afghanistan. Israel were the Americans' primary partners in the campaign, although the NATO alliance was called upon to assist, as we've discussed. The campaign never reached the scale as the real GWOT in our timeline. The goal had always remained hunting down and bringing the terrorists to justice, not nation-building. Alas, the Taliban government was much more sympathetic to the terrorists than to the U.S., and the mission took over a decade. Most U.S. military operations in Afghanistan officially ceased by 2014. However, they continued to clandestinely assist the Israelis, who were still operating both in the country and in the broader region. The largest effects the attack and the subsequent war had were feeding anti-Islamic and anti-Arab xenophobia among certain elements in American society, not unlike the real world, and it caused the U.S. military to shift its priorities and its doctrine from fighting a conventional war, that is, a ground war against the Soviets or the West Coast, to counterinsurgency. Recall all the way back from Part 2 that we calculated that the total U.S. population in 2017 was around 180 to 200 million, about 60% of that of the real world. If we do some more extrapolation, we can calculate the total size of the U.S. military to be about 810,000 in this setting, assuming all other things equal. The real U.S. military numbered around 1.36 million in 2017. In order to force project across the world and engage in these distant campaigns, a relatively higher percentage of the personnel and assets would have to be dedicated to logistics and support functions as opposed to combat units. This is less of an issue in the context of a counterinsurgency or low-intensity conflict where the majority of the fighting is going to be done by specialized units, but this led to concerns that the U.S. military was now facing a shortfall in more traditional combat units. This was especially true of the U.S. Air Force, where the majority of the focus had been placed on airlifters and precision strike aircraft such as the F-117 and B-1, at the expense of air superiority fighters and close air support aircraft. The U.S. Navy faced similar issues. Priority was given to filling out the crews of their aircraft carriers and air wings, then to supply ships, and finally, whatever was left over went to warships and submarines. The cause of the Great Recession of 2006 can be summed up thusly: debt. We have to rewind to the immediate aftermath of Yellowstone to get a full grasp on the situation, though. After the refugee camps were cleared out by the National Guard, the surviving refugees from the Great Plains states had nowhere else to go. Many ended up fleeing on foot to nearby towns on the banks of the Mississippi River, where they panhandled and/or sought refuge in churches. In some cases, sympathetic farmers would hire the refugees on as farmhands. Many of the refugees had been farmers themselves before the eruption, offering them food and a place to stay in exchange for labor. Still others had grown disillusioned with society and fled either back into the eruption zone or deep into the woods of Wisconsin and Minnesota, where they formed hobo communities and tried to live off the land and whatever they could scavenge. The American public was much more sympathetic to the refugees than their government was, especially in the Midwest. Those in charge couldn't other this group of refugees. They were red-blooded, God-fearing, patriotic American farmers. The Democrats used the fact that the Reagan administration had slaughtered the very people who voted for them as their main message during the 1988 Dukakis presidential campaign. Mr. Dukakis styled himself as this generation's FDR, and even staged a photo shoot of himself standing in front of a massive portrait of Roosevelt. Despite being lampooned in the press, the Democrats won in a landslide. The Dukakis administration reinstated several New Deal programs to both employ the refugees and begin rebuilding the eruption zone. The Public Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, and Civilian Conservation Corps were all tasked with rebuilding infrastructure. The Farm Security Administration was put in place to both provide financial assistance to farmers and also research methods of clearing the ash from the soil and make it arable again. Finally, the Resettlement Administration was set up to help the elderly, disabled, and families with children resettle in eastern cities. Of course, neither the federal or state governments were taking in much income from taxation at this point, so these programs were funded either by bonds or through loans taken from countries whose economies had survived relatively intact. These programs were generally successful, although not as much as their original incarnations back in the 1930s. The only standout was the Resettlement Administration, which was expanded to fight the wider issue of poverty and homelessness in the mid-90s. The U.S. would revert to an industrial/export-driven economy more akin to the 1940s and 50s, rather than the service-based economy that had emerged in the early 1980s. The mills around the Great Lakes began churning out steel once again. Ironically, many of the great infrastructure projects undertaken by the West Coast during the 2000s were made with American steel. Most Japanese and Korean cars could no longer be imported to the U.S. after the eruption. Plus, after the Parch incident and Carrier War, companies from either country weren't too keen on doing business in America anyways. Most European imports were still too expensive for the average American. This led to a resurgence in the U.S. auto industry, as they now had a, quote, captive market selling domestically. With effectively no competition for affordable cars, vehicles from the Big Three noticeably stagnated in design and features as the technology gap widened in the 2000s and 2010s. In spite of this industrial stagnation, there was still an upper middle class centered on the eastern seaboard who still demanded the services and luxury goods they had grown accustomed to prior to the eruption. They were able to keep up an air of affluence throughout the 90s and 2000s through playing the stock market and financing much of their lifestyles through credit. This bubble kept ballooning, and eventually the markets were so inflated compared to the actual output of the American economy that a crash was inevitable. Thousands saw their portfolios disappear overnight, and subsequently began to default on their credit card and loan payments. Ironically, the less affluent folks living in the Midwest and Southeast were actually better off than the upper class, since they didn't have anything to lose. The steel mills and public works projects were the only steady jobs that could be found, and they were already filled by former refugees and those already living in the big cities. This led to a lopsided economic recovery. By 2017, the upper class was still trying to claw back the wealth they had enjoyed in the 90s. Meanwhile, the U.S. had significantly reduced homelessness and poverty through the Resettlement Administration. To many of the Yankee elites, this reeked of socialism, and the dreaded communist takeover Reagan had warned about all those years ago. The biggest failing of the United States after the eruption was the failure to mitigate the myriad of chronic health conditions that arose as a result of Yellowstone. Of course, many of those who had fled the eruption zone had been physically scarred by the cataclysm. Burns, smoke and ash inhalation, and hearing loss were the most common injuries. Many of the refugees had also suffered from malnutrition for months, if not years, after the eruption until they found stable housing. This led to low bone density, arthritis, and developmental issues in children. The American healthcare system was not optimal for helping a large population of chronically ill people in the best of circumstances. After the eruption, it was completely useless. Without insurance, Medicaid, or the cash to pay for care up front, during the 90s, many refugees who did not have life-threatening conditions were simply turned away. Medicare reform in the early 2000s promised to make it easier for average folks to enroll in the system, but the 2006 recession delayed implementation until 2009. In the meantime, a new treatment had emerged on the market: opioid painkillers. They wouldn't treat the underlying issue, of course, but they would provide some relief to those suffering from chronic pain for a fairly affordable price without insurance. Hundreds of privately funded pain management clinics popped up all around the country, each conveniently with a pharmacy attached, ready to dole out pills. These pills were wildly addictive and created a loyal base of repeat customers. Of course, over time, one would build up a tolerance to the opioids and require higher and higher doses to feel any effect. Some people would resort to driving around to different pill mills just to get a fix, while others moved on to other, more potent opiates. Of course, Americans' opinions on the West Coast ran the gamut, from a courteous respect to downright hatred. The centrist, silent majority of Americans viewed the secession of the West either as a blameless result of a natural disaster or as a specific failure of the Reagan administration. By 2016, they understood that the path to reunification was long and complicated, if the West Coast was even willing to rejoin the Union at all. Mostly, Middle America just seemed to be happy that, as of late, they could finally get their hands on a new TV or smartphone of decent quality at a fair price. The exception to this was the full return of Alaska to American control, as per the Administration Treaty, which was broadly supported across American society. To the right wing, though, the mere existence of the three new nations was a national disgrace. The fact that, in their view, American territory had been held hostage by hippies and commies, and nothing had been done about it for 30 years, was a sign of just how far America had fallen from superpower status. They went looking for a messianic figure that could deliver them to glory once again. To the Manifest Destiny Party, all of these factors, the decade of war, the stagnation of the economy and technology, the opioid crisis, the loss of American prestige, all of it could be blamed on one thing: the secession of the West Coast. The easy solution to America's problems was swift military reconquest of the western states. Negotiations and free trade agreements had failed. The West Coast was thriving, while most of the U.S. had been left to rot. Since the United States had originally settled the West, they felt entitled to the wealth and resources of the western states. The MDP's strongest bastions of support were paradoxically the aforementioned upper-class Yankee elites along the eastern seaboard and rural southern white folks who still held on to neo-Confederate or strong right-wing beliefs. These unlikely allies rallied behind a New England billionaire known for his outspoken pro-reconquest and right-wing political beliefs. With that said, the centrist Democrats and Eisenhower Republicans of the Great Lakes and Midwest were still just as popular as ever, and no one expected this upstart party to actually go anywhere. Until next time. She started missing shifts, first at her day jobs, then at the clubs she danced at. Bills began to pile up as every cent of her income went to buying more pills. Eventually, her condo was foreclosed on. With nowhere else to go, she ended up begging her dealer, Chewy, for a place to stay. He said she can stay with him and have all the pills she wants, in exchange for doing domestic and sex work for him and his boys. Deeply disgusted, Candy drove off. But, after sleeping in her car for a few days and taking the last of her pills, she can't handle the withdrawals, and she's back on Chewy's doorstep. She lives in his house for a few months with a couple of his other girls, who are also addicts. She keeps upping the dosage and eventually trying different drugs to try and escape her new reality. First, she moves from oxycodone to heroin, and then to amphetamines. A couple of her former clients reach out to her, offering to check her into rehab, but she feels trapped. At least when she's high, she knows she can be mellow for a few hours, and she can keep the withdrawals away. When she's not high, though, her life is miserable. One night, she tries a new drug Chewy's brought in, fentanyl. This stuff is supposed to be 10 times stronger than oxy. She snorts a tiny bump before going to bed. At this point, she doesn't care if she wakes up or not. That night, she had a dream for the first time in a while. She was standing back at her family's farm with her entire family. Her brothers and parents were still alive. They were still there for her, even at the lowest point in her life. She reached down and grabbed a handful of soil. In the center, there was a tiny seedling, one little grain of hope. She awoke with a clear mind for the first time in months. After all she'd been through, she couldn't go out like this, selling herself for drugs in a crack den. She needed to go somewhere she knew she could be safe and get away from it all. She loaded her few meager possessions into her car and used the remaining minutes on her phone to call her brother. She asked if he could wire over some of her cut of the farm profits early so she would have money for gas. She was coming home to the farm. Until next time.